Hello, welcome everyone to this HEAS talk, the last talk of the semester. I'm going to introduce Ramiro. Ramiro Barberena is an Argentinian archaeologist, currently a professor and researcher at National University of Cuyo in Argentina, and a researcher in the Catholic University of Temuco in Chile. He obtained his degrees in anthropology, archaeology from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina. During his career, he focused his work in archaeological sites from South Patagonia, North Patagonia, and more recently in the Southern Andes, where he's directing archaeological excavations. He obtained funding from the Argentinian Research Council, Werner Graham Foundation, and National Geographic to carry on his research. He has been a visiting researcher in the University of Western Australia, Pasteur Institute in France, and the University of Bonn. Some of his main interests are the peopling of northwestern Patagonia, obsidian archaeometry and geoarchaeology, the study of stable and strontium isotopes for discussing diet and migrations in the Southern Andes, which is probably what he's going to talk about today. So welcome, Ramiro. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Can you listen to me well? Is it okay? Okay, thank you. Well, I'm so happy to be here and to see so many people. It's really a pleasure. And I'm really thankful for this. I want to start by saying that we are working with human remains whose descendants live today in Mendoza area in the Andes of Argentina, and we struggle to make them collaborators of our project, and they are now very happy to do so. So this project has given us the possibility of developing collaborative work with them, and this has been fascinating and new for me. But I will start by stating our goals. We want to study the processes that lead to the establishment of socio-ecological diversity in the Southern Andes, particularly during the agropastoral period, encompassing the last relatively 3,000 years before present. In doing so, I will focus on what we can consider average processes, let's say everyday processes, daily life, and anomalous processes that happen once in a while, which may interrupt, let's say, the daily movement of life, that may have very lasting, very important consequences in terms of the historical trajectory. So I will be studying spatial organization, which we can consider an average process, a daily process, and human migration, which we can consider in any case as an anomalous, perhaps disruptive process. These two levels, let's say the average and the anomalous, constantly interact, and in the end up shaping the historical trajectories of human societies. There is one concept that I find fascinating, one idea, which is human life history. It's a very simple idea, which is the power that I think resides there. It is in human life histories when we can connect the average, the daily, let's say the everyday life of people with the anomalous, with those events that happens maybe once in a generation, maybe once every 10 generations. So human life histories are, for me, a fundamental place to understand how these two different levels of dynamics interact. And we can look at human life histories on a multi-scalar approach, from the scale of the individual to the groups, to the communities, and beyond, even reaching the level of ethnic groups. Here you have some images of the places I'll be talking. I'll give you some more detail later, but this is more or less, let's say, the broadest introduction. I will say that South America, and the Andes in particular, can be defined as a land of diversity in more than one sense. But I will start with the geography. Here we have this is basically humidity in South America. What you see in red, it's the South American arid diagonal, huge deserts. A large part of South America are actually deserts. From southern Patagonia here to the north of Chile, Peru, the coast of Peru, etc. And this is established by the wall of the Andes, which interrupt all the winds from the westerlies and also the winds from the Atlantic. Well, the interaction between this Andean wall and the air masses from the Pacific and from the Atlantic produced this highly diverse, this, let's say, broad desert but highly diverse on a micro-regional scale. And I think that this geographical diversity is fascinating in order to look at how, I mean, and without being deterministic, in order to look and to understand how human diversity can be compared with this level of geographic diversity. So there is enormous ecological variation in this landscape produced by the high topographical variation, by a very seasonal landscape. This is a highly seasonal landscape, and by other minor and larger scale variables. And in top of this is also, this has been and it is, of course, a land of social diversity, particularly so during the last 3,000 years before present, more or less, depending on where you are, which saw a number of fundamental changes, not happening all at once, but happening more or less within that period, which was, we could define this as the development of agropastoral human societies. This happened along the process of camel domestication. We end up from the wild guanacos and wild vicunias, we end with domesticated llamas and domesticated alpacas in some places of the Andes. The domestication of a large number of plant species, many of them in the Amazons, but then spreading, some of them in Mexico, but then spreading to the Andes, to the drylands. We have maize agriculture, which was a huge form of human adaptation along the Andes. We have, of course, potatoes, squashes, beans, etc., etc. The appearance of ceramics happens more or less at this time. So this is a period where we see an enormous social diversity. We see hunter-gatherer people, we see pastoralists, intensive farmers, part-time farmers, and people that does perhaps some of these things a few years and then others. So this is a highly flexible landscape with a lot of diversity, which is perfect in order to look and to understand forms of social interaction, ranging from the cooperative to the conflictive to whatever may have happened in the past along this fascinating time. And then, of course, I'm not working in all the Andes. We're going to zoom in a region. This is, you can have it here. This can be defined as the Southern Andes. And we selected this region, actually these north-south valleys between the mountains. These are highland valleys because of a number of reasons. One is that it provides a fabulous, a key north-south biogeographic corridor, which may have been used for people to move along the Andes, along hundreds of kilometers, and then to connect the Andes with, let's say, the Pacific world, because the main trans-Andean passes, the mountain passes, lie along, can be accessed through these valleys. Well, and these valleys have also, and this is also fascinating, an amazing preservation. This is something that you don't see everywhere. I mean, perhaps some of you have had the chance to work in highly, I don't know, Denisova Cave, for instance, like pockets of wonderful preservation. Well, that's not the regular stuff. This area is absolutely dry, and for that reason, among others, it has led to an amazing preservation of soft tissues, of archaeological plant remains. I will talk about that later, of farming fields, of a lot of wonderful forms of archaeological evidence. And in addition to this geographic aspect, this macro region, let's say, lies near the frontier, the archaeological frontier between, let's say, a hunter-gatherer world south here and a farmer world in the north. This is not a clearly defined frontier. This was not static at all, but more or less this was a frontier area during the last 1,000 years. So that makes it fascinating in order to understand how agropastoral societies evolved, how these people interacted with hunter-gatherers, culturally, biologically, genetically, and in a number of ways. And this is also, as I was mentioning, a highly seasonal landscape. So you have a summer landscape and then you have a winter landscape where most of the Andes cannot be crossed, at least without a very high risk. So seasonality is a huge issue here, which we are really just starting to analyze. I'm now going to jump into something a bit more technical, but I love strontium isotopes. I have to say right from the start, I'm not I'm biased towards strontium isotopes, but not just per se, but because they give us the chance to look at fascinating processes which were basically invisible a few years ago. I don't know if perhaps you all know how strontium isotopes work more or less, but I'm just going to explain it very briefly. But strontium isotopes are a tracer of geography, not of diet, as carbon or nitrogen isotopes. I'm going to talk a bit about that too, but about geography. Strontium isotopes begin on the rocks. The amount of strontium depends on the type of rocks, the age of rocks, and basically they are eroded, they go to sediments, soils, plants, animals, without significant isotopic fractionation. What means that you have, let's say, if this were a closed system, you would have the same strontium values all along this food chain. So this is a perfect proxy of paleogeography, where an organism lived in the past, whether it is a plant, an animal, a human, whatever. And if you combine the analysis of different tissues of a particular individual, you get a window into where an individual was born, how was it died, I mean, during childhood, where did it live its last years of life, and that opens the window to look at migration. So basically, of course, the geological diversity in a region determines the resolution you can get, how far you can go in this analysis. And the first step is to build a landscape of strontium. We need to construct a landscape of strontium in order to make sense of their human remain values, etc. And we do that by analyzing rodents, particularly. Could also be plants, which provide a measure of the bioavailable strontium in a given region. And then we use that to compare with the human remains. And this is, as I say, this is a paradise for strontium lovers. Why is that so? Because it's very diverse. This is just, let's say, the macro geological regions. There is a lot of minor scale variability, but this macro variability is the one we're interested in, which, I mean, basically it's north-south variability. So it's perfect to look at east-west mobility. We don't have resolution to discuss north-south mobility. We do have resolution to discuss east-west, west-east mobility, which is the one we are most interested in, because it's the one providing access to ecological, topographical, and perhaps even so social variation across the Andes. And we go from very young rocks here, 40 million years, to very old rocks here, more or less 500 million years. So that we go from very low strontium, higher, 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 and very high strontium. So we have like a perfect framework to begin to understand the scale of human mobility, past territories, and the incidence of migration. And these are some of the places where we've been sampling rodents, we've been sampling plants in order to build a landscape of strontium isotopes, basically. This is the people we work with in the University of Cape Town. Petrus, who's now a fan of the Pumas. I don't know if you know what the Pumas are. It's a rugby team. And Julie Lewitt, analyzing stable isotopes. This is a very technical aspect, but I have to say that perhaps, I don't know, perhaps some of you will be wondering, because I'm going to be talking about strontium isotopes in teeth and in bones. There is some people that screams when you say strontium isotopes in bone. That's impossible. There's diagenesis, there won't be any preservation. Yeah, okay, that may happen, but that's not always the case. And we have to have the capacity to analyze when that's the case and when it is not, actually. So I'm confident that while we cannot rule out diagenesis on all the processes I'm going to talk about you now, I'm confident that the results are largely primary because of a number of reasons. We have some indirect proxies of showing little to no, let's say little diagenesis on elemental ratios. The environmental setting is very, very dry, less than 100 millimeters of precipitation per year. Their remains are relatively young. I'm going to mostly talk about the last 1,000 years. And there is also something which is very important, I think, which is contextual parsimony. When you don't have an indirect or let's say, an adaptable indirect proxy of the quality of a signal, you have to rely on the parsimony of the argument you're trying to build. And the results I'm going to present show parsimony between paired tissues from the same individuals, teeth and bone, show parsimony between the strontium isotopes and the dietary results, well, and a number of other aspects, which I'd be happy to discuss later. And finally, something which is very important, diagenesis would not produce a migrant signal. Diagenesis would, in any case, produce what migrant samples would be obscured as local individuals because they are incorporating strontium from the soil. This is technical, but I just wanted to say it. This is the isoscape, the strontium isoscape that we built with a machine learning approach. It's a very simple model with three predictor variables, which are rock type, rock age, and distance, in this case, to Pacific coast, which explain basically a large part of the strontium variability that we see. So this is a very robust framework, although it needs to be improved, of course, to interpret human mobility. And these are the geological regions, mean rock age, and distance to coast, and how these three variables behave between the Pacific coast and the hinterland. So we have very high values on the Pacific coast, which is the marine strontium, then very low values. They go up to Precordillera in Argentina, and they go down again. Mean rock age shows exactly the same, and distance to coast shows something very similar, where you have high strontium values on the coast, but not as high as you have in Precordillera, which is a very old rocks. So it's a relatively nice framework to look at human variation. Now I'm focusing on these valleys I mentioned. This is what we could think of as the local range for these valleys. These are all rodent samples. These are a bunch of human samples from 28 human samples from 4 archaeological sites that we interpret as local people. They are from different sites, more or less different periods. And then we have amazingly 50 human samples from 3 different archaeological sites, which are absolutely different to what we think are the locals and to the regional signal. So this is, let's say, we think this is a non-local signal. And then building on this, we think that this is a migration signal. Yeah, but I'm gonna focus on 2 levels of processes. First, this, which gives us the window to what I mentioned as the average human organization. And then this, which I think opens the way to analyze the anomalous dimension of human variation. And then, of course, we want to mix these things up. So this is what was thought before we started working. These are oxygen isotopes from different regions. What you see here is not a lot of variation. You see relatively similar values from the highlands to the lowlands. And this was interpreted as very high human mobility, meaning this is more or less the same people with perhaps seasonal ranges connecting the lowlands with the Andean highlands, basically very broad human territories, very low territoriality, absence of frontiers, we could say. So this was the pattern built on the basis of oxygen isotopes on human remains, high mobility connecting different geological regions. This is highly significant in terms of what implies for all aspects of human organization, including, I don't know, variability on the particular sites, etc. Then we took a very small human sample and we did strontium and oxygen on the same samples. And what you see here is that what appeared as no variation that you could interpret as high mobility can be disaggregated on a landscape which is highly diverse, and which in any way can't be interpreted, this cannot be interpreted as high mobility, and as the same people coming and going from the lowlands to the highlands. Basically, these are, with the exception of these two probably, these are like distinct spheres of human mobility. But this was a very small sample. So what we think is that these preliminary strontium results suggested restricted territories, perhaps the existence of more marked frontiers, but it changed the way in which we were seeing at all the other aspects of evidence, including, I don't know, the diversity of rock art, ceramic types, settlement patterns, etc., etc. This is based on the isoscape that I showed. This is a reconstruction of what would be the local human territory. This is an isoscape-based reconstruction of mobility for let's say the last 1,000 years more or less. And this is a landscape connecting this precordillera, the valleys in the middle that I showed. This is Uspallata Valley and the Andes. And the signal is very consistent with a mix of the sediment from this and this, basically. Precordillera and Andes Cordillera. So this is a very different picture where we see much more restricted landscape of human use, probably less mobility, but that's something we still need to discuss. But it's completely different to what we were thinking before. And this is the first level, which is the scale of human mobility. We tend to assume that people moved a lot, that people move little, but in most of the cases, we actually don't know, because we don't have direct measures. Even our lithic rocks are not a direct measure of mobility. They can be a measure of mobility, but they are actually a technological record which need to transform into forms of human mobility. This is a record of human mobility. This is a signal on the human remains that is saying us how much these people were moving and how wide their territories were in the past. And there is a second dimension, which is the one I'm most fascinated by, which is the, let's say, the anomalous migration signal, the migration signal. Unlike what you can see in the archaeology of Europe, of many places in Asia, migration is a highly neglected subject in the archaeology of South America. It is now, and it has been for many decades. I don't really know why. Could be a mix of theoretical bias against migration as a response to an overly migrationist view, interestingly influenced by the Circle of Vienna in the 1940s, 1950s, Oswald Menguin, for instance. But as a mix of bias and as a mix of probably lack of analytical capacity, we haven't been discussing migration in the past. It's like people was always there. And why would we think that? I mean, if migration happens today, if maybe most of our grandparents migrated from somewhere, why? I mean, why would it be different in the past? We simply weren't seeing it and weren't putting it forth to discuss. So I'm going to briefly analyze the geographical, chronological, and dietary dimension of what I think is a migrant population in the Southern Andes. And then we will develop a multiscalar approach to the dynamics and possible consequences of migration. And this is just to remind you, these are the migrants. There are lots of paired tissues here. I mean, 17, I think, paired tissues, so implying that 2 samples from the same individual, but there are many, many migrants. Most of those migrants, well, these are sites that were excavated in the 1930s, 1940s. And most of these migrants come from 2 particular sites, which can be defined as ossuaries. One of them has more or less 200 individuals, and it was drawn like this in a very artistical fashion by the excavator in the 1930s, basically implying it was a very small site with a lot of people apparently thrown in the site without much arrangement, without any mortuary goods. So it's a fascinating site in many ways. And it looks like we could say that there were families there. I mean, we don't know that, but there are men, there are women, there are lots of children. Almost, I think, yeah, 54% of the individual, let's say, determined individuals are children. So this could be interpreted as families, something that we will have to look upon with DNA and other stuff. But it's fascinating in this way. And there might probably be a catastrophic formation of the site. We know it's not one event, but we also know that it's not a lot of time happening here. So we have 50 samples, 16 only individual samples, plus 17 pair bone, tooth, petrous samples from particular individuals. And this is one photo of partial view of this very old excavation. We want to put a temporal dimension to this. These are all 16 direct dates for migrants. These are, let's say, direct dates for the processes, for the process we are trying to look at. We model this as a phase. There are no outliers. And here you can see the duration of this migration phase, which happens more or less 100 years before the arrival of the Inca Empire. As you may know, around 1400s, perhaps a bit after, the Inca Empire arrives to this area, to these valleys, which actually constitute the southernmost frontier, perhaps the southern frontier, let's say, of all the Inca Empire, reaching also north of Ecuador, for instance, a large part of South America. Well, the southern frontier was more or less around this area. And this is our migration phase, which has a median of duration of 125 years. If we take that number, just to explore the meaning of this, it's at least, let's say, it's 5 human generations. Could be 4, could be 3, but this is an intergenerational process, which is, for me, even more fascinating than if it were, let's say, a unique event. A unique event would be wonderful, but to have an intergenerational process of migration from the same place to the same place, and something which is even more fascinating, all these people were dying in this Uspallata Valley before adopting the local Strontium signal. They have all the same non-local signal, which implies that sometime after arriving to this region, they died. Of a reason we still don't understand. We are doing some different things to try to understand that, but that's fascinating in many ways. It's unexpected and it's fascinating. Then we model and we analyze the economic dimension of the locals, of the migrants. Basically, in yellow there, you have the locals. This is strontium here and carbon apatite here. Those are the locals, and all of these are migrants. Then I can explain the differences between the colors, but basically, all these group of people are the migrants. And what we can say is, basically, these people have diversity on the vertical axis, which is economic diversity, is the carbon isotope, ranging from, let's say, relatively C3 diet to relatively C4 diet, which would imply maize. The migrants, on the other hand, are very little diverse in terms of carbon. It's very C4. They were eating a lot of C4 food, which is likely maize. So there are, we begin to see that there are also social differences, at least economic differences between the locals, more diverse diets, less intensive farming, perhaps a multi-population sample. I think that's the case for the local people, which is also more diverse in chronological terms. And then the migrant is exceptional C4 values, maize, I think, intensive farming, and a striking dietary homogeneity, and also a strontium homogeneity, with some diversity provided by the pink there, which is the childhood of adult migrants. I can talk a bit more about that later. So this evidence for the migrants, plus the mortuary context, which suggests high demographies, which suggests perhaps a lot of young people, which is consistent with, let's say, relatively large populations, may suggest high demography, little mobility, highly cohesive groups, and I think also may suggest people that may have been also sedentary, something which is not usually considered when you work in this part of the Andes. When you look at the isotopic niche, this is a measure of the diversity combining strontium and carbon. You see that the migrants have a very restricted isotopic niche. This is a lot of people doing the same, eating the same, moving the same, and this is the locals. Basically, it's also a large number of people, but more diverse. So there is a measure of organizational diversity in this isotopic niche information. And then if we put, these are our migrants, and we put them in the Andean context. This is a lot of samples from all of the Andes, even Peru here. This is Wari Empire, or Wari. They ate a lot of maize, and we know they ate a lot of maize. This is northwestern Argentina. They also eat a lot of maize. And these are our migrants. I mean, they are comparable to northwestern Argentina, which is far to the north, and they are comparable even to some cases from Peru, and much higher than all the other samples from the southern Andes and from many other samples. So this is an exceptional maize intake. Well, I cannot say that. And this is opening the way to a record of highly intensive farming in this area of the southern Andes that was unknown before. And of course, opens the window to something that you may be wondering, where do these people come from? We know they are migrants. They are having diets which are comparable to those of people far to the north. Well, we don't know where they come from, but we have some ideas. And while we have to define that most likely with Strontium, the dietary information may be very useful too. This is Lumila's work. She did this for her PhD. It's a wonderful work. Well, she can explain, of course, better than I, but this is a geometric morphometrics approach to diversity in the craniofacial information of these human remains. This is important both in terms of human genealogies, in terms of biological distances, but also, and this is highly important, in terms of cultural identity. Because some of this variation, particularly in the crania, is associated to an intentional modification of the cranium through different practices, which are usually, but not always, but usually associated with aspects of human identity, of cultural identity, particularly in the Andes. So this is something that we are, with Lumi and with people from the Institute Pasteur, we're looking forward to combine this with the paleogenomics information and to try to see how cultural identity, how morphological variation, and how paleogenomics combine in order to gain, let's say, an additional insight into this social variation in this period. Briefly, there are differences in artificial modification in locals and migrants, though there is also some overlap. Some details there that we can talk about later, but this is a highly significant dimension. Then, to put this in time, this is a signal from locals through time, the migrants, then the Inca arrival, happening after the initial of the arrival of the migrants. Oh, there is something I didn't mention. I have to go back for this. These 2 points here, this and this, are one teeth and one bone from the same individual in the migrant side, but with a local signal. So we have the migrant side with a lot of migrants and one individual buried together, which was a local. He was born there, he died there, and he was buried in a cemetery with people which we can presume were socially different, though they may have been also similar in ways. So it's one individual, but it opens a fascinating window of analysis for us. So there is one local individual buried within the known locals. This is an unknown social context for us. We don't know how to explain that. This is called the late intermediate period. It's basically before the Inca. This was rapidly followed by the arrival of the Inca with a strong local presence in these southern valleys, particularly in Uspallata. You may have heard, I know you work with some mummies record, but in this area, there is the Aconcagua mummy. It's an Inca mummy. Some of them, those located farther south, which is associated with the Inca, of course. So we think that there was a multi-ethnic society at the time of the arrival of the Inca, perhaps for a very long time, with locals and non-locals interacting in diverse ways, which we still don't understand fully how, but which are fascinating. If we zoom out from these local patterns, the time when migration happens is the time where we have most people on the landscape. This is basically all the radiocarbon dates from Mendoza, from San Juan, from the macro region during the last 4,000 years before present. And we see that during this time there was, well, there are lots of dates. Probably there was a lot of people, and this may have provided the demographic context for migration. Because you need to have, I assume, a push process that makes you migrate and a pull process that makes you go somewhere, as is usually discussed in migration studies. And we need to find with these processes are or where. Well, I'm getting ready. I'm about to finish. I don't want to make it too long. But there is something really, if we zoom a bit more out, the case I'm presenting comes basically from this area. We can say that during this late intermediate period, there was a lot of migration. And basically, if we compare this with the southern central Andes, which is northern Chile, Peru, I mean, at least with the cases that have been studied more systematically, there appears to be no migration during this period, at least not significant migration. I'm talking about Strontium results compiled by these people down here. So we see that at the same time, which was a period of high demography in all of the Andes, there is a lot of migration here, and there is apparently very little to no migration there in the north. So we have a hypothesis to make sense of this. In the north, it has been suggested by basically all the researchers working there that this was a period of enhanced cultural diversity, conflict. There is a lot of evidence of defensive structures on the sites. So there is cultural diversity, there is conflict, there is it's a highly heterogeneous period. And it is suggested by some people that basically you couldn't migrate even if you wanted, because most of the places of the landscape were socially taken, let's say, by other groups of farmers, for instance. I mean, it wasn't easy to migrate, even if you had a situation in which you may have needed to do so. While this may have been different in this case, where we see what may have been a lower demography, a more open landscape, though there was a lot of people still. So in the end, we want to discuss the possibility that during this particular period where there was a lot of people on the landscape, this is associated with the medieval climatic anomaly, which is a dry period. And it was dry, I mean, not in all of the Andes at once, but it was a relatively dry period. And that's particularly sensitive if you are a farmer. So we may have an opportunity to look at different social strategies to social stress, when in some cases you decide to migrate, and in some cases you cannot migrate, and other sort of things happen, conflict, enhanced cultural diversity, etc. In any case, we need to find an explanation of why these apparent contrasts in the intensity of migration happened in the Andes. So just to finish, and looking at our future research, let's say summarizing this, we see that this was an intergenerational process of migration, however consistent along this period of time in source of migration, in end of migration. Perhaps there were sustained push factors that were affecting these human groups during different generations, climate change, disease load. There might be some evidence of TB present in these sites, though we still need to confirm that. There were organizational differences between these groups of people, the locals, the migrants, in terms of economy, in terms of mobility, and probably also in terms of morphology and in terms of identity. And there is a local in a migrant grave. That's fascinating in terms that since it opens social questions. What were the social connections between these people? Why this happened? And why did the migrants die relatively soon after arriving to this new area, to this new landscape? And now, yes, to finish, this is thinking in terms of our future research. This that you see here, I imagine you see like a geographic pattern, like geometrical pattern. Can you see something? Maybe not. There are some lines here. Well, you can look at that closer than there. Basically, this is a huge irrigation system. This is a 1 kilometer scale, and this is just a small part of one side in the highlands of these valleys with a huge irrigation system. This is an alluvial cone coming down from the Andes, where basically every flat surface was irrigated and was used for farming. We don't know of what still. We haven't started studying this, but we will do it this year in particular. And I'm finding very interesting the idea of that Robert Spengler put forward for Eurasia, something completely different, that the settlements of agropastoral people may have functioned as habitat islands from a biogeographical perspective, where we can look upon processes of domestication, plant and animal domestication, basically like, let's say, islands of niche construction, which may have been segregated from other islands dispersed across the Andean landscape. So I'm very interested in looking at the ways in which these agropastoral societies constructed their niche by modifying the landscape in many possible ways. This is, I think, relevant for studies of plant and animal domestication. There may have been multiple centers of domestication of the same species, and that appears to be the case with at least some species. And then I want to connect this level of agricultural organization, agricultural technology, with the level of human life histories. Because this, and I'm not suggesting something very concrete, but this is a frontal cordillera area where people grow a lot of things, which might be isotopically consistent with the source of the migrants, which have a signal that we can compare to, let's say, frontal cordillera. Am I saying that they came from here? No, we don't know that. But this kind of situation, it's economically and geologically consistent with the possible source of the migrants that we are studying in some other places. So we want to look at ways to combine the dimension of human life histories at multiple levels with the spatial organization, with the economic organization in particular places in the landscape, which are very far from where the migrants were found. This is like 400 kilometers to the north. And this is an approach that I think may guide a comparison with other places in the world. Eurasia comes to my mind automatically, where agropastoral societies are being studied in a perspective which is very similar to this one, and how the pastoral and the farming components of human organization may be required in order to some systems to function, as has been recently proposed, for instance, for Tibet or for Mongolia, for the plateau. Well, I think that there is a fascinating possibility to compare how these agropastoral niches were constructed in different continents, despite the differences. In fact, I think that the differences are the one that make the comparison more valuable. So having said this, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.